The town of Providence, Nebraska, existed as a stubborn foothold against the vast, unforgiving prairie. It was a place of straight lines and hard angles, of wooden houses built to defy the horizontal tyranny of the wind. In the autumn of 1887, the town's collective consciousness was turned toward a single, looming certainty: the coming winter. The previous year's season had been a brutal one, a wolf winter that had taken the young and the old and had left a permanent shadow in the hearts of those who remained. It had taken Elara Vance's husband, claimed by a fever that the relentless cold had refused to release. She was 24 years old, an orphan married for 2 years, and a widow for 7 months. In a town that valued community above all else, her solitude was a type of sickness. She lived at the northern edge of the settlement, in a small, sturdy cabin her husband had built, a location that was now seen as dangerously isolated. Her presence in the general store was met with averted eyes and pious whispers, the kind reserved for those touched by profound tragedy, as if misfortune were a contagion. On the evening of September 14th, 1887, Elara Vance walked into the town hall, her face pale, but her jaw set with a resolve that unnerved the men gathered there. The town council was meeting to discuss winter preparations, the communal woodpile, the distribution of salted meat, the boarding of the schoolhouse windows. It was an assembly of grim-faced men, their authority as solid and unyielding as the frozen earth would soon be. She carried with her not a plea for charity, but a proposition. It was an idea born of heretical wisdom, a plan inherited from her grandfather, a man who had lived more with the Pawnee than with his own kind, and who had learned to read the land not as an adversary, but as a difficult partner. Her proposal was simple in its concept and staggering in its audacity. She intended to challenge the very way Providence understood survival. Mayor Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently chiseled into an expression of weary pragmatism, called the meeting to order. He acknowledged Elara with a curt nod, a gesture that was more dismissal than welcome. Beside him sat Silas Croft, the owner of the only timber lease for 50 miles, a man whose wealth swelled with every degree the temperature dropped. And at the end of the long table, Reverend Miller, whose sermons often blurred the line between the wrath of God and the fury of a Nebraska blizzard, steepled his fingers and watched her with cold, assessing eyes. They were the architects of the town's conventional wisdom, the guardians of the established way of doing things. "Miss Vance," the mayor began, his voice flat, "we have a full docket. I trust your business is of some urgency." "It is, Mayor," Elara replied, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear she felt. She unrolled a piece of draftsman's parchment on the table. On it, in precise charcoal lines, was a map of Providence. But it was a map unlike any they had ever seen, for it depicted not just the buildings on the surface, but a proposed network of lines beneath them. "I am here to speak about the winter. Not just this winter, but all the winters to come. I propose we build a winterway." A low murmur rippled through the assembled men. Silas Croft leaned forward, his chair groaning in protest. "A winterway? What fanciful nonsense is this?" Elara ignored him, addressing her explanation to the entire room, her tone didactic and firm, as if she were a schoolteacher instructing a class of slow-witted pupils. "A covered, subterranean passage. It would connect the essential buildings, the doctor's house, the general store, the well, and this hall. It need not be deep. 8 feet below the surface is sufficient to place it beneath the frost line. The earth itself provides insulation. At that depth, the temperature remains a constant, manageable 40 to 45 degrees, regardless of the air temperature above. It would be a safe conduit for travel during the worst of the storms, impervious to the wind chill that kills more people than the cold alone." She pointed to a cross-section drawing on her parchment. "The principles are sound. It is about utilizing thermal mass. The ground absorbs the sun's energy all summer and holds it. By digging into it, we are not escaping the world. We are seeking shelter in the warmest part of it during the coldest time. My grandfather learned this from the people who lived on this land for 1,000 years before we came. They understood that you do not fight the prairie winter. You accommodate it by burrowing into its hide. Reverend Miller scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. Miss Vance, we are civilized men, not prairie dogs. God gave man dominion over the earth, to build upon it, to raise spires to the heavens. He did not intend for us to dig in the dirt like frightened badgers. There is a profanity in what you suggest, a lack of faith in the very structures we have raised. With respect, Reverend, Alara countered, her gaze unwavering. I saw nothing of God's dominion in the eyes of my husband as he died last February, his lungs filled with ice. I saw only a force of nature that our tall houses and our faith could not repel. This is not about faith. It is about thermodynamics. It is about wisdom. Mayor Thompson held up a hand, silencing the growing debate. He studied the plans with a dismissive air. And the cost? The labor? We are already strained to lay in adequate supplies. To divert men to such a project would be irresponsible. It is the work of months, perhaps years. It is the work of foresight, she insisted. The labor of one autumn would protect us for a generation. The cost in timber for the shoring would be a fraction of the wood we burn simply to stay alive each year. This last point struck a nerve with Silas Croft. His face, already ruddy, darkened. A fraction of the wood I provide, you mean? Miss Vance, are you suggesting the good people of this town should live in a damp, dark hole instead of by a warm, cheerful hearth fed by good American oak? It's preposterous. It's the talk of a woman whose grief has clearly unsettled her mind. The insult hung in the air, thick and cruel. The other men shifted uncomfortably, but none came to her defense. The verdict had been delivered. She was not just an eccentric. She was unstable. Her ideas the product of a grieving female mind, and therefore not to be trusted. Her logic was irrelevant. Her identity as a young widow superseded it. The earth is not damp at that depth if properly ventilated, she stated, her voice losing none of its conviction, though she knew her cause was lost. And it is not dark if you provide for lanterns. It is, however, safe. Mayor Thompson rolled up her parchment and pushed it back across the table towards her. The gesture was final. The council thanks you for your input, Miss Vance, but we will be sticking to proven methods, a well-stocked larder and a deep woodpile. That is the Providence way. This meeting is adjourned. The men filed out, leaving Alara alone at the long table. Not one of them had truly considered the science she presented. Not one had looked past her youth and her widowhood to the logic of her plan. And not one, she knew, would admit they had been wrong, even if the winter proved them so. She walked out of the hall into the crisp September air, the useless parchment clutched in her hand, and looked toward her small cabin on the edge of town. The council had made its decision for Providence. Now, she would have to make one for herself. Her decision was made before she reached her own doorstep. If the town would not build a winterway, she would build her own. A smaller one, a private network of survival. It would not save the community, but it might save her. The following morning, on September 15th, 1887, she took the train to North Platte. There, in a dusty pawn shop, she sold the last fine thing she owned. Her late husband's silver pocket watch, a family heirloom from his father. The shopkeeper gave her $47 for it, a fraction of its worth, but to Alara, it was the seed capital for her salvation. She did not squander a penny. Her first stop was the lumber yard, where she purchased a stack of rough-hewn pine timbers, 6x6s for the vertical posts, and 8x8s for the cap beams. She selected each piece herself, checking for cracks or knots that might compromise their integrity under the immense pressure of the earth. Next, she went to the hardware merchant, acquiring 2 kegs of 10-inch iron spikes, a new shovel with a reinforced steel spade, a heavy-duty pickaxe, and a wheelbarrow with a solid iron wheel that would not split in the cold. Finally, she purchased 4 oil lanterns and a 20-gallon barrel of kerosene. The total cost of her materials came to $36.50. The remaining $10.50 she reserved for dried beans, salted pork, and flour. It was all the money she had in the world. Back in Providence, she began her work on September 20th. She did not start by breaking new ground. Her cabin, like most, had a small root cellar accessible through a trap door in the kitchen floor. It was a cramped, earthen room, 10 feet square and 7 feet deep, where she stored potatoes and preserves. This cellar would be the nexus of her entire system. It provided a discreet starting point, hidden from the prying eyes of the town, and it meant the first 10 feet of her excavation were already complete. Her plan was methodical, a testament to the engineering mind she had inherited from her father, a man who had built bridges for the railroad. Her private winterway would consist of 3 tunnels radiating from the cellar. The first, and most important, would run 60 feet due east to her woodshed. The second would extend 40 feet north to the small, insulated chicken coop. The third, the most ambitious, would be a 100-foot tunnel heading south, ending in a simple, deep chamber she called the cold larder, designed for storing butchered meat and perishables far deeper than a conventional cellar. The physical labor was immense, a grueling testament to human endurance. She started with the woodshed tunnel. Each day she would descend into the cellar, light a lantern, and begin to dig. The soil was a dense, clay-like loam, heavy and damp. The rhythm of the work took over her life. Plunge the shovel, heave the earth into the wheelbarrow, push the laden barrow up a specially constructed ramp and out into her yard. Tip it over. Repeat. For 10 hours a day, this was her world. The scrape of steel on dirt, the smell of the deep earth, the burn in her shoulders and back. The townspeople watched her. At first, they were merely curious about the growing mound of earth beside her cabin. But as the pile grew day by day, curiosity curdled into mockery. Children invented games, calling her home the Gopher Hole. Men passing on the road would tip their hats with exaggerated slowness and call out, "Digging to China, Miss Vance?" Silas Croft made a point of driving his wagon past her property, piled high with cords of oak, a rolling monument to the conventional wisdom she had rejected. The women whispered that her grief had finally broken her, that she was digging her own grave. She heard it all, but she did not stop. The growing mountain of excavated soil was proof of her progress. Furthermore, she was not wasting it. With painstaking effort, she packed the loose earth against the northern and western foundations of her cabin, creating a thick, insulating berm that rose 3 feet up the exterior walls. Her house was, quite literally, becoming part of the landscape. By mid-October, she had excavated the full 60 feet of the woodshed tunnel. It was a raw, earthen passage, 4 feet wide and 6 feet high. Now came the most critical and dangerous part of the construction, the shoring. Working from the woodshed back toward the cellar, she began to erect the timber frame. This was a process that required absolute precision. She first dug footings for the vertical posts, ensuring they were perfectly level. Then, with a system of ropes and levers, she wrestled the heavy 6x6 posts into place, 2 at a time, 4 feet apart. The most difficult step was hoisting the 8x8 cap beam on top of the posts. Each completed frame was a small victory, a wooden skeleton that would hold back the crushing weight of the world above. She drove the iron spikes through the joints with a heavy sledgehammer, the percussive booms echoing in the confined space, a sound that was both terrifying and reassuring. She worked by the steady golden light of her lantern, a small bubble of warmth and order in the subterranean darkness. She learned the personality of the earth she was invading. She found a vein of smooth, flat stones, which she painstakingly excavated and used to pave the tunnel floor, providing a clean, stable walkway. She encountered a thick, stubborn root from an ancient cottonwood tree and spent 2 full days hacking it apart with her axe. She developed an intimate knowledge of the ground beneath her feet, a relationship far more profound than that of the farmers who merely scratched its surface. A key element of her grandfather's design, detailed in his worn leather journal, was ventilation. A tunnel without airflow would become a stagnant, suffocating tomb. To solve this, she dug 2 narrow shafts, each 6 inches in diameter, straight up from the tunnel's ceiling to the surface. One was near the midpoint, and the other was near the woodshed entrance. To disguise them, she found 2 hollowed-out tree stumps, which she placed over the holes. To an outside observer, they were just ordinary pieces of prairie detritus. In reality, they were the lungs of her winter way, allowing for the slow, constant circulation of fresh air. By the first week of November, with the first snows already dusting the plains, the woodshed tunnel was complete. The moment she walked its full length for the first time, from the warmth of her kitchen to the cold, wood-scented air of the shed, without once stepping outside, was a moment of quiet, profound triumph. She had done it. She had built a corridor of safety, a defiance of the elements forged from timber, sweat, and scorned wisdom. She allowed herself a small, weary smile, then went back to the cellar and began digging the tunnel to the chicken coop. The work was far from over. Throughout November and into the first bitter weeks of December, Ilara continued her relentless labor. The ground grew harder as the frost deepened, the top layer becoming as unforgiving as iron. But her work was now almost entirely subterranean. Below the frost line, the earth remained pliable, a consistent, workable medium. The town had largely given up mocking her directly. Her project had become a simple, accepted fact of her madness. She was the Mole Woman, a local eccentric, a cautionary tale whispered to children about the dangers of solitude and grief. She paid them no mind. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of her tunnels, 4 feet wide, 6 feet high. The chicken coop tunnel was shorter, only 40 feet, and she completed its excavation and shoring by December 18th. Now, she could feed her hens and collect their eggs, her only source of fresh protein, without exposing herself to the increasingly hostile weather. The final tunnel, the 100-foot passage to the cold larder, was the most taxing. It was a long, lonely dig into the dark, away from any existing structure. She finished the excavation just after Christmas and spent the first few days of the new year of 1888 setting the last of the timbers. By January 4th, her system was complete. Her cabin, woodshed, chicken coop, and deep larder were all connected by a network of dry, secure, and ventilated tunnels. She had spent a total of 107 days on the project. She had moved an estimated 3,000 cubic feet of earth by hand. She was exhausted, her hands calloused and raw, but she was ready. The morning of January 12, 1888, dawned with a strange and deceptive calm. The temperature was unseasonably mild, and a soft, hazy sun hung in the sky. Children, released from their winter confinement, were playing in the schoolyard. Farmers took the opportunity to move livestock, and Mayor Thompson himself was overseeing a crew clearing snow from the town hall roof. There was no warning, no portent in the sky. The old-timers who knew the prairie's moods felt a prickle of unease at the unnatural stillness, but their concerns were dismissed as folk superstition. At approximately 11 in the morning, the world changed. A low gray line appeared on the northwestern horizon. It was not a cloud bank. It was a solid, advancing wall, a churning curtain of gray and white that seemed to consume the sky as it approached. The temperature, which had been a mild 30 degrees Fahrenheit, plunged with astonishing speed. Within 20 minutes, it had dropped to 10 below zero. Then, the wind hit. It was not a gale, it was a physical blow, a solid wall of force moving at an estimated 70 miles per hour. It picked up the loose snow from the ground and hurled it forward, creating a total, instantaneous whiteout. This was the blizzard that would later be known as the schoolhouse blizzard, so named for the many children who were trapped and died on their way home. It was a storm of unprecedented violence. Visibility dropped to zero. The air itself became a lethal weapon, a maelstrom of ice particles and wind so powerful it stole the breath from one's lungs. To be caught outside was not a risk, it was a death sentence. Inside her cabin, Alara felt the house shudder under the initial impact of the wind. The windows, already frosted, were instantly plastered with a thick, opaque layer of wind-driven snow. The sound was the most terrifying part. A deep, demonic roar that was not merely a noise, but a vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. It was the sound of a world being torn apart. But inside, the air was still. Her fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth pushing back against the encroaching cold. After a few moments, she stood up and walked to the trap door in her kitchen. Lifting it, she descended the ladder into her cellar. The air in the tunnel was cool, a steady 45 degrees, and utterly silent. The monstrous roar of the blizzard was gone, replaced by a profound, muffled quiet. It was as if she had stepped into another world. She lit a lantern and walked the 60-foot passage to her woodshed. The tunnel was exactly as she had designed it, a sanctuary of stillness. She gathered an armful of split oak logs, enough for the next 12 hours, and walked back to her kitchen. She did not have to fight the wind. She did not have to risk frostbite or disorientation. She simply walked through the earth. Later, she made the trip to the chicken coop. The hens were agitated, sensing the fury of the storm above, but they were safe and warm. She collected 3 eggs and returned, the sound of her own footsteps the loudest thing in her subterranean world. For the first time in months, she felt not just safe, but vindicated. Her madness had a function. The storm raged without pause. The sun set without anyone in Providence seeing it. The world was a howling vortex of white. In town, panic had given way to a grim struggle for survival. Families huddled in their homes, stuffing rags into the cracks around windows and doors, burning through their precious wood piles at an alarming rate. The wind, a merciless thief, sucked the heat out of their well-built houses, leaving a killing cold in its wake. Sometime around 7 o'clock that evening, Alara heard a noise. It was not the wind. It was a frantic, rhythmic banging. It took her a moment to place the sound. It was not coming from her cabin door or windows, which she knew must be buried under a massive drift. It was coming from below, from the trap door. Heart pounding, she grabbed a heavy iron poker and crept to the cellar entrance. She lifted the door a few inches and called out, "Who's there?" A boy's voice, weak and trembling with cold, answered her. "Please, let me in. It's Thomas. Thomas Thompson, the mayor's son." Alara threw the door open. A small figure, caked in snow and ice, stumbled up the last few rungs of the ladder, and collapsed onto her kitchen floor. It was the mayor's 12-year-old son. His face was a waxy white, his lips blue. He was in the advanced stages of hypothermia. She dragged him to the fire, cut away his frozen coat, and began rubbing his hands and feet, forcing warm broth between his chattering teeth. Slowly, the boy's story tumbled out. His younger sister had been taken with a sudden croup. With the doctor unable to travel, the mayor had sent Thomas to the general store for medicine just as the storm hit. He had made it there, but on the way back, he had become completely disoriented in the whiteout. He was lost, freezing, only 100 yards from his own home. In his panic, he remembered the strange woman on the edge of town, the one who was always digging. He had stumbled in the direction of her property, found one of her disguised ventilation shafts by pure chance, and followed the slight draft of warmer air to the berms of earth around her cabin. He had clawed his way through the snowdrift against her cellar door, his last act of desperation. As he recovered his senses, his terror returned. "They're trapped," he sobbed. "Everyone! Mr. Croft is there, the Reverend, my father. They were all at the store when it hit. They can't get home. And Mr. Henderson, the owner, he says the wood is almost gone." Ilara looked from the boy's terrified face to the roaring hearth. The general store. It was the heart of the town, but it stood a good 200 feet from her cabin. Her tunnel network was a closed system, designed only for her own survival. It went nowhere near the center of town. She walked over to her own map, still tacked to the wall. She studied the lines she had drawn, the product of so many months of planning. Her woodshed tunnel, the 60-foot passage running east, was the one that pointed most directly toward the town. From the end of that tunnel, the general store was another 150 feet away. 150 feet of frozen, unforgiving earth. A sane person would have dismissed the thought as impossible. Digging in a blizzard through ground that was frozen solid? But Ilara Vance had long ago parted ways with the town's definition of sanity. She had a pickaxe. She had shovels. She had lanterns and fuel. And now, she had a purpose beyond her own survival. "Thomas," she said, her voice calm and resolute, "drink the rest of that broth. Get warm. Then you are going to help me. We have work to do." She donned her heaviest woolens, gathered her tools, and loaded 2 extra lanterns and a can of kerosene onto a small sled she had built for moving supplies in the tunnels. With the boy trailing behind her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, she descended once more into the quiet earth. They walked to the far end of the woodshed tunnel, to the solid wall of timber and earth that marked the boundary of her sanctuary. "Here," she said, pointing to the end wall. "The store's cellar is in this direction. We are going to dig." The work was brutal. She used the pickaxe to break up the densely packed, semi-frozen soil at the tunnel's end. The shock of each blow traveled up the handle and into her arms, a jarring, painful impact. Thomas, though weak, proved useful. He cleared the dislodged earth with a shovel, piling it against the tunnel walls. They worked in the small, flickering pool of lantern light, a tiny pocket of human endeavor carved into the heart of a frozen world. Above them, the blizzard howled, its fury utterly irrelevant to the task at hand. They worked in shifts. While one dug, the other rested, sipping water and eating the dried beef she had brought. There was no sense of time in the tunnel, only the rhythm of the work and the slow, agonizing advance. Every foot they gained was a monumental victory. The air grew thick with the smell of sweat and earth. Ilara's muscles screamed in protest, but she did not relent. She was driven by a cold, clear certainty. On the surface, men of influence and authority were freezing, their conventional wisdom having failed them utterly. Below the ground, a lone woman, armed with scorned knowledge, was digging to save them. The irony was not lost on her, but she felt no triumph in it, only a grim sense of duty. After what felt like an eternity, perhaps 5 or 6 hours, the tip of her pickaxe struck something that was not earth. It made a hollow, wooden thud. Wood. She swung again, and this time a small splinter of aged pine fell away. It was a foundation beam. They had reached the general store. With renewed urgency, they cleared the earth around the foundation. Ilara found the seams between the thick planks of the cellar wall. Using the pointed end of the pickaxe as a lever, she began to pry at them. The wood was old and brittle. With a loud crack, one of the planks gave way. A rush of frigid air, smelling of coal smoke and fear, washed over them. Ilara widened the opening and held her lantern up. She peered into the gloom of the Hendersons' mercantile cellar. Huddled together against the far wall were a dozen figures, wrapped in blankets and burlap sacks, their faces gaunt and gray in the flickering light. They looked like ghosts. Among them, she recognized the faces of authority: Mayor Thompson, Silas Croft, and Reverend Miller. They stared back, their eyes wide with disbelief, at the impossible sight of a woman's face, framed by dirt and determination, appearing through a hole in their frozen prison. "Mayor Thompson," Ilara said, her voice raspy with exhaustion, "I believe you have a meeting to attend." There was no grand pronouncement, no triumphant speech. Ilara simply led them out of the freezing cellar, one by one, into the steady, quiet cool of her tunnel. The contrast was stunning, a physical shock to their systems. They left a room where the temperature was well below freezing, where frost was climbing the walls, and entered a space that felt, by comparison, almost balmy. They walked in stunned silence, a procession of the town's most powerful men, led through a subterranean passage by the woman they had publicly ridiculed as a lunatic. They followed the trail of her lanterns through the winding passage she had clawed from the earth, past the turnoff to the chicken coop, and finally to the ladder that led up into her kitchen. As they emerged into the warmth and light of her small cabin, the full weight of their deliverance settled upon them. They saw the simmering pot of soup on her stove, the stack of dry firewood by the hearth, the calm order of her home. It was an island of life in a world of roaring death. Mayor Thompson was the first to speak. He looked at his son, safe and warm by the fire, and then at Ilara. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by a deep, humbling shame. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice thick with emotion, We called you a fool. We mocked your work. We were the fools. We built our houses tall, and the storm is tearing them down. You built into the earth, and it has given you shelter." Silas Croft, the timber merchant, stood shivering by the door, not from the cold, but from the shock of his own irrelevance. "My woodpile," he said to no one in particular, his voice a hollow whisper. "It must be under 20 feet of snow. All that oak. It's useless. Your earth is what saved us." His entire fortune, his entire identity, was based on selling fuel to fight the cold. And in the ultimate test, it had proven worthless against a woman with a shovel and an idea. The blizzard raged for 2 more days. For those 72 hours, Ilara's cabin and her winter way became a sanctuary for the 15 people who had been trapped in the store. They survived on her stores of food, slept in shifts on her floor, and used her tunnels as their entire world. The passages became corridors of life, connecting them to warmth, to sustenance, and to each other. In the quiet depths, the rigid social hierarchy of Providence dissolved. The mayor, the reverend, and the merchant were no longer men of authority. They were simply survivors, indebted to the foresight of the outcast they had scorned. They saw firsthand the genius of the ventilation shafts, the stability of the shoring, the simple, undeniable logic of the entire system. When the wind finally died and a weak, watery sun appeared on the morning of January 15th, the world it revealed was a ruin. The town of Providence was buried, its straight lines and hard angles erased beneath monumental drifts of snow. Several smaller cabins had collapsed under the weight. The church steeple had been torn away. It would be weeks before they knew the full toll, but it was immediately clear that lives had been lost. Every single person who had taken refuge in Ilara's cabin, however, had survived. Not one of them had lost a family member who was with them. Not one had suffered from the cold after reaching her. And not one would ever again speak of her with anything but profound reverence. The aftermath of the Great Blizzard of 1888 marked a turning point in the history of Providence. The town did not just rebuild, it reimagined itself. Ilara Vance, the mole woman, the grieving eccentric, became Ilara the founder, the sage of the winter way. In the spring, when the great melt finally came, a delegation of men, led by a humbled Mayor Thompson, came to her door. They did not carry writs or pronouncements, they carried shovels and surveying equipment. They asked for her guidance. Under her direction, the men of the town began a new, communal project. They did not just repair her tunnel, they expanded it. Using her methods and her meticulous plans, they extended the winterway from the general store to the doctor's house, then to the school, and finally, in a gesture of ultimate concession, to the church. Over the next 2 years, the network grew, a secret circulatory system beneath the town's feet. Branch tunnels were dug to every single home, each family contributing the labor to connect their own cellar to the main artery. The Providence Winterway became the town's defining feature, a legend on the high plains. It was a testament not to brute force or arrogant defiance of nature, but to the humility of accommodation. It was a living monument to the simple, profound truth that Ilara had understood all along, that true strength and safety were not to be found in building higher, but in digging deeper, in seeking partnership with the very elements one sought to survive. Her vindication was not loud or boastful. It was as quiet, as deep, and as enduring as the earth itself. A silent, irrefutable lesson in the wisdom of listening to the forgotten knowledge of the past.